I found out my boss has been taking credit for my projects in executive meetings I'm intentionally not invited to. I was staring at the email when my coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered across my keyboard. The subject line read, "Congrats to David Blackwell, Q3 Innovation Award winner." Below it was a photo of my boss holding a crystal trophy, standing next to our CEO Robert Garrison, both smiling wide. The caption underneath made my vision blur. Blackwell's revolutionary client retention algorithm saves company $2.3 million annually. That algorithm was mine. Every single line of code, every late night, every weekend I'd missed my daughter's soccer games to debug that system. I'd sent David the final documentation 3 months ago, right before he told me the executive meeting had been postponed. It hadn't been postponed. He'd presented my work as his own while I sat in my cubicle, completely unaware that my career was being stolen in real time on the 15th floor. The irony was that I'd actually admired David when I first started at Meridian Analytics 18 months earlier. He had this way of making you feel heard in meetings, nodding thoughtfully while you explained your ideas, asking just the right follow-up questions to make you think he genuinely cared about your professional development. He was 43, Harvard MBA, with salt and pepper hair and expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. During my interview, he talked about fostering innovation and creating opportunities for talented engineers to shine. I'd been so grateful when he hired me. I was 31, decent programmer with a solid background in machine learning, but nothing spectacular on paper. David said he saw potential in me. He said he wanted to mentor me. I'd worked my ass off to prove him right, staying late, volunteering for the hardest projects, building solutions that actually moved the needle. I thought I was building a career. Turns out, I was just building his. It started small, the way these things always do. About 6 months into my tenure, I'd developed a new data visualization tool that made our client reporting process about 60% faster. I'd shown it to David in our weekly one-on-one, walking him through the technical architecture, the user interface improvements, the projected time savings. He'd been enthusiastic, almost giddy. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we need," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Let me take this upstairs, show the executive team what my department is capable of." I'd been thrilled. I assumed my department meant I'd be included in that presentation, or at least credited. The following week, I'd seen an internal newsletter praising management's commitment to operational efficiency, with a quote from David about driving continuous improvement initiatives. My tool got a brief mention. My name appeared nowhere. When I'd asked David about it, he'd looked confused, almost hurt. "Oh man, I'm sorry. I thought they'd included everyone's names. You know how corporate communications is, they always butcher these things. But trust me, the executives know it was a team effort." I'd believed him. That was my first mistake. The second incident happened 2 months later with a client segmentation model I'd built from scratch. This one was more complex, more valuable, requiring me to teach myself advanced clustering techniques and spend 3 weeks analyzing 5 years of customer data. The model could predict client churn with 87% accuracy, allowing our account managers to intervene before we lost business. It was legitimately groundbreaking for our industry. David had been ecstatic when I demonstrated it. "This is game-changing work," he'd said, already reaching for his phone. "The Q2 strategy meeting is next Thursday. This is exactly what we need to show we're staying ahead of the curve." I'd started preparing my presentation deck immediately, working through the weekend to make sure every slide was perfect. Monday morning, David called me into his office. "So I've been thinking about Thursday's meeting," he said, fingers steepled on his desk. "These executive sessions can be pretty intense, lots of aggressive questioning, political dynamics you're not familiar with. I think it might be better if I present this one. You know, protect your work from getting torn apart by people who don't understand the technical nuances. Once they approve the concept, we'll do a bigger rollout where you can present to the whole company." It sounded reasonable, almost protective. I'd thanked him for looking out for me. Thursday came and went. I'd waited for David to tell me how the presentation went, but he'd been in meetings all day. Friday morning, I'd finally caught him in the hallway. "Oh, it went great," he'd said, barely slowing down. "They loved it, really loved it. We'll talk more next week about implementation." That was it. No details, no feedback, no mention of next steps for me. The following Monday, an email went out from our CEO praising David Blackwell's innovative approach to client retention and announcing a company-wide rollout of his segmentation model. I'd read that email 5 times, each time feeling sicker. There was a lengthy paragraph describing the technical methodology, the data sources, the validation process. Every word was pulled directly from my documentation. The only name mentioned was David's. When I'd confronted him, his expression had shifted to something between sympathy and annoyance. "Look, I mentioned you were on my team," he'd said, "but at that level, they want to hear from leadership. It's not personal, it's just how business works. You built something great, and it's getting implemented. Isn't that what matters?" He'd made me feel naive for caring about credit, ungrateful for wanting recognition. I'd walked away feeling like I was the one being unreasonable. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't imagining things. Over the next 8 months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every major project I completed, every innovation I developed, would disappear into David's office and emerge in company communications as his achievement. a machine learning pipeline that automated our quality assurance process, a new API integration that opened up 3 major client partnerships, a forecasting tool that helped us bid more competitively on contracts. Each time, David would express initial enthusiasm, promise me visibility, then present it to executives in meetings I was systematically excluded from. Each time, my name would be absent from the follow-up communications. Each time, David's reputation would grow while I remained invisible. I started keeping a detailed log, documenting every project, every conversation, every promise David made and broke. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things, that this was just how corporate environments worked. But the knot in my stomach kept tightening. My wife, Rebecca, had noticed I was coming home later and more irritable. "Is everything okay at work?" she'd asked one night. "You seem stressed." I told her I was fine, just busy. I didn't want to admit that I was starting to suspect my boss was systematically stealing my career. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in September. I'd arrived at the office early, around 6:30, to finish documentation on my latest project before the rest of the team showed up. This one was my masterpiece, 9 months of work, nights and weekends, the kind of comprehensive system that could define a career. I'd built an entire predictive analytics platform that integrated customer behavior data, market trends, and operational metrics into a unified dashboard that could forecast business opportunities with unprecedented accuracy. Initial testing showed it could identify high-value opportunities an average of 38 days before our competitors, giving our sales team a massive advantage. I'd stress-tested every component, validated every algorithm, documented every function. It was bulletproof. As I was reviewing the final deployment checklist, I heard David's voice echoing from the conference room down the hall. The door was ajar, and I could see him on a video call with someone, his back to the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his voice carried clearly through the quiet morning office. "Yes, Robert, I'm confident this platform will transform our entire go-to-market strategy," he was saying. "I've spent the last 9 months developing the core architecture, and the results exceed even my projections." My blood went cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, laptop bag still hanging from my shoulder, listening to David describe my platform to our CEO using the exact technical terminology from my documentation. He talked about the neural network configurations I'd implemented, the data normalization techniques I'd pioneered, the custom visualization framework I'd coded from scratch. He described challenges I'd overcome, design decisions I'd made, solutions I'd engineered through weeks of trial and error. Every word was mine. Every innovation was mine. But the way David spoke, with such casual confidence and ownership, made it sound like he'd personally written every line of code. "I'm planning to present this to the board next month," David continued. "This is the kind of strategic asset that justifies my promotion to VP of Analytics. The platform alone should drive at least $5 million in new revenue next fiscal year." I backed away from the conference room slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. VP of Analytics. He was planning to ride my work all the way to an executive position, and I wasn't just being excluded from credit anymore. I was being completely erased from the narrative of my own creation. I spent that entire day in a fog, going through the motions of meetings and emails while my mind raced. Every interaction with David over the past 18 months replayed in my head, but now I could see them clearly, stripped of the trust and naivety that had blinded me before. The private one-on-ones where he'd pump me for technical details. The way he'd always insist I send him complete documentation for the records. His systematic exclusion of me from any meeting where executives were present. The carefully worded emails where he'd summarize my work in ways that made it sound like his own ideas that I'd merely implemented. He hadn't been mentoring me. He'd been mining me. I was his ghost engineer, producing innovations he could claim while keeping me isolated enough that no one in leadership would ever connect my name to the work. The genius of it was how he'd made me complicit in my own exploitation. Every time I'd sent him detailed documentation, every time I'd agreed to let him protect me from difficult executive meetings, every time I'd accepted his explanation that credit didn't matter as much as impact, I'd been handing him another piece of my career to steal. That night, I told Rebecca everything. We sat at our kitchen table until past midnight while I walked her through every project, every broken promise, every stolen achievement. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each example. When I finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. "You need to talk to HR," she said finally. "This isn't just unfair, this is probably illegal. Intellectual property theft, fraud, something. There has to be a legal term for what he's doing." I'd nodded, but I felt sick. Going to HR meant declaring war. David was a senior director, well-connected, with 18 years at the company. I was a mid-level engineer with less than 2 years of tenure. Who would they believe? "I need proof," I said. "Solid, undeniable proof. Right now it's my word against his, and he's got all the power." Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then get proof," she said. "You're the smartest person I know. You built a platform that predicts business outcomes. You can figure out how to prove what he's been doing." She was right. I just needed to treat this like any other engineering problem. Define the objective, identify the resources, design a solution, execute methodically. I started gathering evidence the next morning. Every email I'd sent David with project details, every document I'd created, every timestamp showing when I'd developed each component. I created a spreadsheet mapping each of my projects to the subsequent company communications crediting David. The pattern was damning when laid out chronologically. Project completion dates, followed by David's presentation dates, followed by company-wide announcements of his achievements. I also started keeping meticulous records of our conversations. After every one-on-one with David, I'd write detailed notes and email them to my personal account. Per our discussion on October 3rd regarding the analytics platform deployment, I documented everything he said about timeline, credit, recognition, future opportunities. I was building a paper trail that would be impossible to dismiss. The hardest part was acting normal around David, pretending everything was fine while I was systematically documenting his theft. He'd smile and ask how my work was going, and I'd smile back and tell him everything was on track, all while my stomach churned with a mixture of rage and determination. 2 weeks later, I found the smoking gun. I'd been reviewing email metadata for a different project when I noticed something odd. An email David had sent to the executive team describing his client retention algorithm contained an attachment with my name in the file properties. The document had been created by my user account, last modified by me, but David had forwarded it as if it were his own work. I dug deeper, using my system's access to check file histories and email logs. What I found made my hands shake. David had been systematically taking my documentation, doing a find and replace to change I to we, and my name to my team, then forwarding them to executives under his name. Sometimes he didn't even bother changing much. My words, my technical explanations, my strategic recommendations, all flowing upward with David's signature at the bottom. I'd found 18 separate instances over the past year. 18 times he'd literally copy-pasted my work and claimed it as his own. I made copies of everything, backed them up to 3 different locations, including a cloud service not connected to the company network. This was evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as a misunderstanding. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Catherine Reeves, our Director of Human Resources. Catherine was 56, had been with Meridian for 12 years, and had a reputation for being fair but thorough. I'd prepared a 40-page document outlining every stolen project, complete with timestamps, email evidence, and file metadata proving I was the original creator. I'd organized it like a legal brief, with a table of contents, exhibits labeled A through R, and a summary of damages that included not just lost credit, but also lost promotion opportunities and compensation. When I walked into Catherine's office that afternoon, her expression was professionally neutral. "I understand you have some concerns about attribution and recognition," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. I handed her the document. "I have evidence that David Blackwell has been systematically taking credit for my work for the past 18 months, I said. Not vague claims about team dynamics. Documented proof that he's been presenting my projects as his own achievements to executive leadership while deliberately excluding me from any meeting where the truth might come out." Catherine spent 20 minutes reading through my document, her expression never changing. When she finally looked up, I couldn't read her face at all. "These are serious allegations," she said carefully. "Corporate intellectual property, attribution, executive communications, these are complex issues. I'll need to investigate this thoroughly before we can determine next steps." She paused, choosing her words precisely. "In the meantime, I need you to continue performing your job duties as normal. Don't discuss this with anyone else in the company, especially not David. Can you do that?" I nodded, though the idea of pretending everything was fine for however long her investigation took felt impossible. "I'll be in touch within a week," Catherine said, standing to signal the meeting was over. "I take these matters very seriously. If what you're alleging is true, there will be consequences." I left her office feeling both relieved and terrified. I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Either I'd be vindicated, or I'd be marked as a troublemaker who couldn't handle corporate politics. There was no middle ground anymore. The next 3 days were torture. I had to sit through meetings with David, respond to his emails, act like nothing had changed while knowing Catherine was somewhere in the building reviewing my evidence. David seemed oblivious, chatting about weekend plans and asking me to prep documentation for an upcoming client meeting. Every interaction felt surreal, like I was watching someone else play a role in a play where I already knew the ending. Wednesday afternoon, Catherine's assistant called. "Ms. Reeves would like to see you at 4 o'clock. Please bring David Blackwell with you." My stomach dropped. This was it. Either Catherine had found my evidence credible and was about to confront David, or she'd decided I was wrong and was bringing us together to resolve a misunderstanding. I had no idea which. At 3:55, I walked to David's office. "Catherine wants to see both of us," I said, keeping my voice neutral. David looked up from his computer, surprised. "Both of us? Did she say why?" I shook my head. "Just said to come at 4. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign he knew what was coming. There was nothing. Just mild curiosity and perhaps slight annoyance at the interruption. We walked to Catherine's office in silence. When we entered, there were 2 other people already there. A man in his early 50s wearing an expensive suit stood near the window, and a woman I didn't recognize sat at Catherine's conference table with a laptop open in front of her. "David, please sit," Catherine said, her voice formal. "This is James Morrison. our outside legal counsel, and Diane Foster, our chief technology officer. Morrison was from the firm name. Wait, I need to avoid Morrison. Let me revise. This is James Whitfield, our outside legal counsel, and Diane Foster, our chief technology officer. David's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Catherine, what's this about? He asked, but he was already sitting down, his body language suddenly defensive. Catherine opened a folder on her desk. We've completed a preliminary investigation into allegations of intellectual property misappropriation and fraudulent attribution of work product. The evidence is substantial and concerning. I'm going to walk you through what we found, and you'll have an opportunity to respond. For the next 45 minutes, Catherine methodically presented my evidence. She showed the emails where I'd sent David original work, followed by emails where he'd forwarded it to executives under his name. She displayed the file metadata proving I'd created documents David claimed as his own. She pulled up internal communications where David took credit for innovations I'd developed. With each piece of evidence, David's face grew paler. He started to interject several times, but James Whitfield would hold up a hand and say, "Let her finish." When Catherine finally paused, David cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was defensive, almost aggressive. "This is a complete mischaracterization," he said. "I'm this department's director. Everything my team produces is ultimately my responsibility and my achievement. That's how management works. I provide strategic direction, I mentor and guide the technical work, I present to executives because that's my job. This is, what, a junior engineer upset he's not getting enough recognition? This is absurd." Catherine didn't react to his tone. She simply opened another folder. "We interviewed 6 other engineers who've worked under your supervision over the past 4 years," she said. 3 of them described similar patterns. Work they created being presented as yours. Systematic exclusion from executive meetings. Promises of credit that never materialized. David's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "Those are disgruntled former employees. Of course they're going to make accusations. This is character assassination based on hearsay and a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate hierarchy." Diane Foster spoke for the first time, her voice calm, but cold. "Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed the technical documentation in question. The predictive analytics platform you told CEO Garrison you personally developed over 9 months contains code architecture and algorithmic approaches that, according to your resume and work history, you don't have the expertise to create. Your background is in business analytics and strategic planning. The platform uses advanced machine learning techniques that require specialized knowledge you've never claimed to possess." She turned her laptop toward him. "Can you explain the neural network configuration in this module?" David stared at the screen, his jaw working. I oversaw the development. The technical details were handled by my team." Diane's expression didn't change. "Your emails to the CEO describe this as your personal development work. Quote, I've spent the last 9 months developing the core architecture. That's not oversight. That's a claim of direct technical contribution. Which is it?" The room fell silent. David looked at each of us in turn, seeming to realize for the first time that this wasn't going to blow over, that his carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. "I want to speak with my lawyer," he said finally. James Whitfield nodded. "That's your right. But I want to be clear about the situation you're in. We have documented evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation of work product, intellectual property misappropriation, and what appears to be a systematic pattern of taking credit for subordinates' achievements to advance your career. The company has grounds for termination with cause, and depending on how you want to proceed, potential legal action for fraud." David stood up abruptly. "This is insane. I've given 18 years to this company. I've built this department from nothing. One junior engineer with an inflated ego is making wild accusations, and you're treating me like a criminal?" His voice had risen, defensive anger replacing his earlier confidence. Catherine stood as well, her voice firm. "David, you need to leave this office now. You're suspended pending the completion of our investigation. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You'll receive formal notification of next steps within 48 hours. I watched David walk out, escorted by 2 security guards who'd apparently been waiting outside. His face was flushed, his movements jerky with barely controlled rage. When the door closed behind him, I realized I'd been holding my breath. Catherine turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "I want to be clear," she said. "This investigation is ongoing, but based on what we've found so far, your allegations appear to be well-founded and extensively documented. The company takes intellectual property theft seriously. We also take retaliation seriously, so if David or anyone else attempts to contact you or creates a hostile work environment, you report it immediately." James Whitfield added, "You may want to consider retaining your own counsel. Depending on how this resolves, you could have grounds for a civil claim regarding lost compensation and career advancement opportunities." I nodded, still processing what had just happened. 18 months of systematic theft, and it had taken one HR meeting to begin unraveling David's entire facade. "What happens now?" I asked. Catherine exchanged a glance with Diane. "Now we complete the investigation, review all the evidence, interview additional witnesses, and determine appropriate consequences. In the meantime, you report directly to Diane. Your current projects continue as normal. I left Catherine's office feeling like I'd just survived a car crash, that strange combination of adrenaline and disbelief. I called Rebecca from my car, hands still shaking. "It's happening," I said when she answered. "They believe me. David's suspended. They found evidence from other engineers too. I wasn't the only one." Rebecca's voice was fierce with satisfaction. "Good. That bastard deserves everything coming to him." That night I barely slept, replaying every moment of the meeting, wondering what David was doing, whether he'd try to fight back or negotiate some kind of settlement. I'd worked so hard to gather evidence, to build an undeniable case, and it had worked. But I also knew this was just the beginning. David wasn't going to go quietly. Someone with 18 years at a company, with an executive track reputation to protect, wouldn't just accept termination. He'd fight, and it might get uglier before it was over. The thought filled me with a mixture of dread and grim determination. I'd come too far to back down now. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Thursday morning, I arrived at the office to find an email from CEO Robert Garrison requesting a meeting at 10. My first thought was panic, wondering if David had somehow gotten to him, spun some story that made me look like the problem. But when I walked into Garrison's office, Diane Foster was already there, along with Catherine Reeves and another executive I recognized as our CFO, Michael Sterling. Garrison gestured to a chair. He was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made it clear how he'd built Meridian from a startup to a $200 million analytics firm. "I've been reviewing Catherine and Diane's preliminary findings," he said without preamble. "I'm appalled, not just by David's actions but by our failure as an organization to catch this sooner. You came to this company with strong credentials and have apparently been producing exceptional work that I never knew about because it was being systematically misattributed." He paused, his expression troubled. "I gave David an innovation award 3 months ago for work you created. I advocated for his VP promotion based on achievements that weren't his. That's not just an internal HR matter. That's a failure of leadership on my part." I didn't know what to say. I'd expected a formal investigation process, legal protocols, maybe eventual vindication. I hadn't expected the CEO to personally apologize. "Sir, you couldn't have known," I started, but Garrison waved me off. "I should have known. That's literally my job, to know what's happening in my company." He leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. "Here's what's going to happen. Catherine's investigation continues, but based on what we've already verified, David Blackwell's employment will be terminated by end of business Friday. We're consulting with legal about potential criminal charges for fraud, though that's complicated. More immediately, we're conducting a comprehensive review of all projects attributed to David over the past 4 years to determine original authorship. Where we can verify your work was misattributed, we'll issue corrections to the record." Michael Sterling spoke up. "We're also reviewing your compensation history. If you've been denied promotions or raises because credit for your work went elsewhere, we'll calculate what you should have earned and provide back pay with interest." Diane Foster added, "I want you to present the predictive analytics platform to the board of directors next month. Not as David's work, not as the department's work. As your achievement, with full attribution. They need to understand what actually happened here." My head was spinning. 24 hours ago, I'd been an invisible engineer whose career was being stolen. Now I was being offered back pay, public vindication, and a board presentation. "I don't know what to say," I managed. Garrison's expression was serious. "Say you'll stay. Because frankly, after what this company put you through, I wouldn't blame you for walking out and never looking back. But we need engineers like you. We need people who create real innovation, not people who steal credit for it. I'm asking you to give us a chance to make this right." I thought about all those nights I'd worked late, all the projects I'd poured myself into, all the times I'd convinced myself that the work itself mattered more than recognition. I'd been wrong about that last part. Recognition mattered. Credit mattered. Not because of ego, but because your career, your compensation, your entire professional future depended on people knowing what you'd actually accomplished. "I'll stay," I said finally. "But I want the record corrected completely. Every project, every innovation, every piece of work David took credit for. Not buried in HR files. Public corrections." Garrison nodded. "Agreed. We'll issue a company-wide communication once the investigation concludes, setting the record straight." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded. Catherine interviewed 12 current and former employees, all describing similar patterns of David taking credit for their work. IT forensics went through 4 years of David's email and file history, finding dozens of instances where he'd appropriated other people's work. The more they uncovered, the more damning it became. David had built his entire reputation, his director title, his executive track status, on stolen achievements. He'd been running an elaborate fraud for years, systematically exploiting the engineers under his supervision while presenting himself as an innovative leader. When the findings were finalized, Catherine showed me a summary. "In total, we've identified 43 separate instances of fraudulent attribution across 7 employees over 4 years," she said. "The company is terminating him for cause, forfeiting all unvested stock options and severance. We're also referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal fraud charges, though I'll be honest, Those are hard to prosecute in employment contexts. David tried to fight back. His lawyer sent threatening letters claiming wrongful termination, demanding his full severance package, threatening to sue for defamation. But the evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Every claim his lawyer made could be refuted with emails, file metadata, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The company's legal team, led by James Whitfield, responded with a 50-page rebuttal that basically dared David to take this to court, where all the evidence would become public record. David backed down. He negotiated a settlement that avoided criminal charges in exchange for a signed confession of the misappropriation, agreement never to work in the industry again, and forfeiture of all claims to severance or stock options. It was, Catherine told me, the best outcome we could have hoped for. David's career was over, his reputation destroyed, and he'd gotten nothing from the company except a permanent stain on his professional record that would follow him forever. 3 weeks after my initial HR meeting, Meridian sent a company-wide email. The subject line read, "Correction to attribution and recognition." The email detailed in careful legal language that projects previously attributed to David Blackwell had been created by other engineers, primarily me. It listed each major project by name, provided the actual creator's name, and announced that all internal records, awards, and communications would be corrected to reflect accurate authorship. The email concluded with an announcement that I was being promoted to senior analytics engineer with a significant raise, retroactive to 6 months prior, along with a formal apology from leadership for the misattribution. My phone started buzzing immediately with congratulatory messages from colleagues. Some I barely knew. Many expressed shock at what David had done. A few admitted they'd always wondered why I wasn't getting more recognition for work they'd known I was doing. That last group made me both grateful and frustrated. If they'd known, why hadn't anyone said anything? But I understood. Corporate culture rewards going along, not making waves, trusting that leadership knows what they're doing. It takes a crisis to break that pattern. The board presentation happened on a Monday in late October. I'd spent 2 weeks preparing, not because I didn't know my own work, but because presenting to a board of directors is fundamentally different from technical documentation. I had to translate complex algorithms and system architecture into business value, market advantages, and revenue impact. Diane Foster coached me through several practice runs, helping me refine the narrative. When I walked into the boardroom, I felt more nervous than I'd ever been. These were the people who'd previously heard David describe this platform as his achievement. Now I had to convince them that not only was he wrong, but that I was the real innovator they should have been hearing from all along. Robert Garrison introduced me, providing context about the investigation and attribution correction. The board members' expressions ranged from curious to skeptical to visibly uncomfortable. I launched into my presentation, walking them through the platform's development, the technical challenges I'd overcome, the business results we'd achieved. I showed them specific code I'd written, explained decisions I'd made, demonstrated functionality I'd built. 45 minutes later, when I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then, the board chair, an older woman named Patricia Drummond, spoke. "This is remarkable work," she said, "and it's deeply troubling that we're only hearing about it now, under these circumstances. The failure of oversight that allowed misattribution to continue for years reflects poorly on our governance." She looked at Garrison. "What steps are we taking to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Garrison outlined new policies, requiring technical leaders to present their own work, mandatory attribution tracking for major projects, regular skip-level meetings where engineers could communicate directly with executives without their managers present. Patricia nodded, then turned back to me. "You've demonstrated exceptional technical capability and, frankly, remarkable patience in addressing this situation through proper channels rather than simply leaving for a competitor. I hope you're being appropriately compensated now." I confirmed the promotion and raise. "Good," Patricia said, "because if I were you, I'd have offers from every analytics firm in the city by now. This platform alone is the kind of innovation that builds companies." She wasn't wrong. I'd already gotten 3 recruiter calls from competitors who'd somehow heard about the situation, but I'd committed to staying at Meridian, at least for now. They'd made it right. That mattered. The following week, I got an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Former colleague reaching out." It was from a woman named Olivia Chang, who'd worked under David 3 years earlier. "I heard about what happened with David," she wrote. "I can't tell you how validating it is to finally have confirmation that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful. He did the exact same thing to me. I built an entire client onboarding system that he presented as his innovation. When I complained, I was told I wasn't being a team player. I eventually left the company because I couldn't stand working for him anymore. I just wanted you to know that what you did, bringing evidence and standing up to him, you didn't just save your own career. You validated everyone he hurt. Thank you." I stared at that email for a long time. Olivia had left 3 years ago. How many others had David pushed out? How many talented engineers had their careers derailed because they couldn't prove what he was doing? The investigation had found 7 victims, but that was just within the current employee base. There could have been dozens more over his 18 years, people who'd quietly left or been forced out when they questioned the attribution. I responded to Olivia, thanking her for reaching out and letting her know that her experience had been mentioned in the investigation. We ended up getting coffee the following week. She was working for a competitor now, doing well, but I could see the lingering frustration when she talked about her time at Meridian. The worst part wasn't even losing credit for my work, she said. It was how he made me doubt myself. Like maybe I was being entitled for wanting recognition. Maybe I was misunderstanding how corporate environments worked. It took me 2 years of therapy to realize I wasn't the problem. Her words hit hard because I recognized that same pattern in my own experience. David had been skilled at gaslighting, at making his victims question their own perceptions and expectations. That psychological manipulation was almost worse than the theft itself. It left scars that lasted long after the immediate harm was addressed. I told Olivia about the new attribution policies Meridian was implementing, the cultural changes leadership was committed to. She listened politely, but skeptically. I hope it works, she said. But culture doesn't change just because you catch one bad actor. It changes when people who saw what was happening and said nothing start speaking up. The months that followed were strange. My professional life improved dramatically. The raise was substantial. The promotion opened new opportunities, and suddenly, I had visibility with executives I'd never interacted with before. Diane Foster became a genuine mentor, introducing me to senior leaders across the company and advocating for my work in rooms I still wasn't in. Projects I'd created became case studies in our marketing materials, with my name prominently featured. I presented at industry conferences, gave interviews to trade publications, built a professional reputation that was finally based on my actual achievements. But I also dealt with unexpected challenges. Some colleagues treated me differently, like I was now management's pet, or had somehow benefited from David's downfall in a way that made them uncomfortable. A few people I'd considered friends became distant, as if standing up for myself made me a threat. The entire department David had run was restructured, and several people lost their positions in the reorganization. I knew logically that wasn't my fault, that those decisions resulted from discovering years of mismanagement, but I still felt guilty. I'd set out to protect my own career, not to blow up an entire department. Rebecca noticed the toll it was taking. You did the right thing, she'd say, when I'd come home stressed and quiet. You exposed fraud. You protected yourself and others. You can't control how the company responds or how other people react. She was right, but it didn't always help. I'd wanted justice, and I'd gotten it. But justice turned out to be more complicated than I'd imagined. David was gone, his career destroyed, his reputation in ruins. I'd been vindicated, promoted, compensated. By any objective measure, the outcome was positive. Yet I found myself angry in ways I hadn't expected. Angry at the colleagues who'd known or suspected but stayed silent. Angry at the company culture that had enabled David for so long. Angry at myself for not speaking up sooner, for believing his lies, for being complicit in my own exploitation. That anger didn't have anywhere to go, so it just sat there, a constant low-level burn beneath everything else. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Patel, helped me work through it. You're grieving, she explained during one session. Not just what you lost, but what you thought you had. You believed you were building a career in a meritocracy. Finding out it was never based on merit, that it was all politics and exploitation, that's a fundamental betrayal. You're allowed to be angry about that. 6 months after David's termination, I was invited to speak at a tech industry panel about workplace ethics and attribution. The organizers wanted someone who could speak credibly about intellectual property protection from an engineer's perspective. I almost declined. Talking publicly about what happened felt uncomfortable, like wearing my professional trauma as a badge. But then I thought about Olivia and the others who'd been pushed out. If speaking publicly could help someone else recognize the warning signs or feel empowered to fight back, maybe it was worth the discomfort. The panel was on a Thursday afternoon at a downtown conference center. There were about 200 people in the audience, mostly engineers and tech professionals. I told my story, carefully avoiding names and company-specific details, focusing on the pattern of behavior and the systematic nature of the theft. When I finished, the moderator opened it up for questions. A young woman in the third row raised her hand. How did you know when to stop rationalizing and start gathering evidence? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but intense. I recognized something in her expression, that same uncertainty I'd felt. When the knot in your stomach becomes permanent, I said. When you start dreading work conversations with your boss. When you find yourself documenting everything defensively because you know something's wrong, even if you can't quite articulate what. Trust that instinct. After the panel, several people came up to talk to me privately. 3 of them described situations eerily similar to mine. Bosses taking credit, systematic exclusion from visibility, gaslighting about corporate norms. One guy, maybe 28 years old, told me he'd been documenting his boss's behavior for months, but was terrified to report it. What if they don't believe me? He asked. What if I become unhireable? I understood that fear completely. The documentation itself is your protection, I told him. Timestamps, emails, file metadata, everything that proves you created the work. If your company has any integrity at all, evidence like that is hard to dismiss. And if they do dismiss it, you probably don't want to work there anyway. He nodded, not looking entirely convinced. I gave him my email address. If you need someone to review your evidence or just talk through the situation, reach out. He thanked me and walked away, and I hoped he'd actually do it. I hoped my story would help him avoid the 18 months of exploitation I'd endured before I finally acted. That was the thing about systematic abuse in professional environments. It thrived on isolation, on victims believing they were alone, or overreacting. Breaking that isolation was the first step toward changing the culture. A year after the investigation concluded, Meridian asked me to help draft new company policies on attribution and intellectual property protection. They wanted something stronger than generic corporate guidelines, something based on actual experience with how these systems fail. I spent 3 months working with Catherine, Diane, and outside consultants to create a comprehensive framework. We established clear documentation requirements for all projects, mandatory attribution tracking, regular skip-level feedback sessions, and protection for whistleblowers who reported attribution issues. We also created a technical audit system where senior engineers would periodically review managers' claims about projects to verify they had the expertise to have actually created what they were taking credit for. It was the policy I wished had existed when David started exploiting me. Would it have prevented what happened? Maybe not entirely. Determined bad actors can usually find loopholes, but it would have made his behavior harder to sustain and easier to detect. The policies were adopted company-wide and became part of Meridian's recruiting pitch. We protect our engineers' work and ensure proper attribution. It became a genuine competitive advantage for hiring talent. I got one last communication from David, about 14 months after his termination. It came through his lawyer, a carefully worded letter that wasn't quite an apology, but acknowledged regrettable misunderstandings about attribution and credit. The letter claimed David had never intended to harm anyone, that he'd misunderstood the boundaries between managerial responsibility and individual contribution, that he'd made mistakes in judgment he now recognized. It was corporate speak designed to avoid legal liability while gesturing vaguely toward contrition. There was no request for a response, no ask for forgiveness. It felt like his lawyer had advised him to send something to potentially mitigate his reputation damage if word of the settlement ever became public. I showed the letter to Rebecca. "What do you think?" she asked. I folded it carefully and put it in the folder with all my other documentation from the case. "I think he still doesn't get it," I said. "Or he does and can't admit it, even to himself. Either way, it doesn't matter anymore." And it didn't. David's opinion of his own actions, his rationalizations and justifications, were no longer my problem. I'd gotten what I needed: acknowledgement, correction, and protection from it happening again. 2 years after everything started, I'm now a principal engineer at Meridian. The predictive analytics platform I built has generated over $8 million in new revenue. I've published 3 papers in industry journals under my own name. I mentor junior engineers, and I'm obsessive about making sure they get proper credit for their work. I watch for the warning signs I missed before: managers who isolate talented employees, patterns of exclusion from executive visibility, systematic documentation requests that could be used for appropriation. When I see something suspicious, I speak up. Not everyone appreciates it. I've made enemies among managers who don't like being questioned. But I've also built relationships with engineers who trust me to protect their work and advocate for their recognition. That matters more than being universally liked. The whole experience changed how I think about work, success, and professional relationships. I used to believe that good work spoke for itself, that merit would naturally be recognized. I know better now. Good work gets recognized when people with power choose to recognize it honestly. When they don't, you need systems, evidence, and the courage to fight for what you've earned. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how everything went down, if I wish I'd handled it differently. The honest answer is complicated. I regret not acting sooner, not trusting my instincts when the pattern first became clear. I regret the stress it put on my family, the months of anger and anxiety that poisoned what should have been a positive time in my career. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret gathering evidence and taking it to HR. I don't regret forcing Meridian to choose between protecting a fraud and protecting its actual innovators, because if I hadn't done that, I'd still be invisible. David would have gotten his VP promotion. Other engineers would have continued being exploited, and I would have spent the rest of my career wondering if I was good enough, smart enough, valuable enough, never realizing that I was all those things, but someone else was stealing the proof. That's what theft of credit really does. It doesn't just take recognition. It takes your confidence, your sense of worth, your understanding of your own capabilities. Getting that back, proving to myself and everyone else what I was actually capable of, that was worth every uncomfortable moment of the fight. The predictive analytics platform I built is still running, updated and expanded by a team I now lead. Every time I see it processing data, identifying opportunities, driving revenue, I remember those 9 months I spent building it. The late nights, the failed experiments, the breakthroughs that came at 3 a.m. when I finally figured out an algorithm that had been breaking for weeks. I remember sending the documentation to David, trusting him to present it fairly. I remember hearing him take credit on that conference call, and I remember the moment I decided I wasn't going to accept that anymore. That decision, scary as it was, uncertain as the outcome seemed, was the moment I took ownership of my career in a way I never had before. Not ownership of the work, I'd always done that. Ownership of the credit, the recognition, the narrative about who I was and what I could do. David had tried to write that narrative for his own benefit. I took it back and wrote it myself. That's the story I tell when people ask what happened. Not a story about a bad boss or corporate politics or workplace drama. A story about deciding you deserve credit for what you create, gathering irrefutable evidence, and refusing to back down when powerful people tell you to accept less than you've earned. If you made it this far, you understand why this matters. Credit isn't vanity. Recognition isn't ego. They're the foundation of every professional relationship, every career advancement, every opportunity that comes from people knowing what you're capable of. Protecting that isn't being difficult or entitled, it's being professional. And if you're in a situation where someone's stealing your work, document everything, trust your instincts, and fight back with evidence they can't dismiss. You deserve to have your name on what you create. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.